Don't forget to like the video, share your thoughts or story in the comments, and subscribe to stay updated with our latest stories. Now before I begin, tell me, where are you watching from? I'd love to know which cities and towns are joining me for this memory that stayed with me for years. It was still dark when I heard the knock. At first, I thought I'd imagined it, the kind of sound your mind plays when you're halfway between sleep and waking. But then came another one, firm yet hesitant, echoing through the quiet of the house. I pulled my robe tighter, shuffled to the door, and there he was, my nephew Daniel. The porch light caught the tired gleam in his eyes, and his hands were tucked deep in his jacket pockets, like he wasn't sure if he should really be there. "Aunt Sarah," he said softly, almost apologetically, "I know it's early. Can I come in?" Of course I let him in. The morning air was biting, and the faint scent of rain clung to his clothes. I hadn't seen him for months. Had moved to another state for work, and life, as it often does, got in the way. But something in his expression told me this wasn't just a casual visit. The kettle whistled as we sat at the kitchen table. The clock ticked a little too loudly for my liking, and for a few moments neither of us spoke. He stared at the steam rising from his mug, his fingers tracing the edge of it like he was gathering courage. "You know," I said gently, "most people would call before showing up at sunrise." He managed a faint smile. "Yeah, I know. I just didn't know where else to go." That sentence hung in the air. I felt it, something heavy beneath it. I didn't ask right away. Instead, I watched him, the same boy I'd once taken to school, the one who used to draw little rockets on my kitchen walls with chalk when he was 6. Now he was a man, sitting across from me, carrying some invisible weight that I could feel but not yet see. Outside, the sky began to lighten, brushing pale gold across the window. The world was waking up, but our little corner of it stayed quiet, suspended in a moment between what was and what was coming. When he finally spoke, his voice cracked in a way that made me tighten my grip around my cup. "I messed up," he said, and I didn't know who else would listen without judging. I didn't rush to comfort him. I've learned over the years that sometimes silence can be kinder than words. So I waited, letting the space between us fill with trust instead of questions. He looked up at me then, really looked at me, as if remembering that despite the years, the distance, and the silence, I was still the same person who once bandaged his knee after he fell off his bike. That memory softened something in him. I could see it in the way his shoulders relaxed, in the way his voice steadied as he began to explain. He told me about his job, the pressure he'd been under, the choices he'd made out of fear rather than conviction. He hadn't done anything unforgivable, but he was disappointed in himself, and that kind of disappointment, the kind that comes from within, is often the hardest to bear. As he spoke, I realized something I hadn't before. Sometimes people don't come to us for solutions. They come because they trust us to hold their truth without turning it into shame. That morning, as the first sunbeam touched the edge of the table, I saw the little boy in him again, the one who used to run into my arms when the world felt too big. I reached out, covering his hand with mine. "You're here," I said quietly. "And that already means you're trying to make it right. That's what matters." He didn't say anything for a moment, just nodded, eyes glistening. Then he exhaled, the kind of breath that sounds like release. We sat there like that, 2 people, one old and one young, bound not by advice but by understanding. And though the sun climbed higher, filling the kitchen with light, a small part of me knew that this early morning visit would stay with me long after the day ended. Because sometimes the most unexpected moments, the quiet knock before dawn, the trembling words over tea, are the ones that remind us how deeply we can still be needed, even when we think our role in someone's story has ended. The rest of that morning passed gently, wrapped in a kind of silence that wasn't uncomfortable, just thoughtful. I made breakfast while Daniel sat at the table, still in the same chair, stirring his coffee long after it had gone cold. The smell of toast and eggs filled the kitchen, and for a while, it almost felt like years hadn't passed, like he was that little boy again who always wanted his eggs cut into perfect squares. When I placed a plate in front of him, he looked up and smiled, tired but grateful. "You still remember how I'd like it," he said. "Some things don't change," I replied, "and some shouldn't." He ate slowly, like his mind was elsewhere. I didn't push him. Over the years, I've learned that when people are carrying something heavy, words are only bridges. They take time to build. So I let him eat, let the quiet morning do its healing. The light outside grew stronger, spilling across the floorboards, and a bird landed on the windowsill as if to remind us that life kept moving forward. Finally, Daniel spoke again, softly, almost as if confessing to the air. "I made someone feel small. Someone I care about. I didn't mean to, but I did." He didn't say who. He didn't need to. I saw the regret in his eyes, the kind that comes when you realize too late how much your words can weigh. "I thought I was helping," he continued, voice breaking a little. "But I ended up pushing them away. And when I tried to fix it, they just stopped answering my calls." I sat beside him, resting my hand gently on his arm. "We all hurt people sometimes," I said, "even when we don't mean to. What matters is whether we learn from it or just hide from it." He looked at me, really looked, like he was trying to understand how I could sound so certain. "Did you ever do that? Hurt someone you care about?" That question took me back years, so many that for a moment the kitchen disappeared. I remembered my own brother, Daniel's father. We'd argued not long before he passed away. Over something so trivial I can't even recall the details. I thought I'd have time to make it right, but life doesn't always give you the chance. "Yes," I said softly, "and I never got to fix it. That's why I always tell myself now, say the good things while you can. Apologize before it becomes too late, because once silence settles between two people, it can be hard to break." Daniel nodded slowly, his eyes glistening again. "That's why I came," he said. "I couldn't sleep last night thinking about it. I thought, maybe talking to you would help me figure out what to do." I smiled, though my chest felt heavy. "Then you did the right thing. You came instead of running away from what hurts." We went for a walk after breakfast. The world was fully awake by then, the sky a clear blue, the trees whispering with the early breeze. We didn't talk much. We didn't need to. Sometimes walking beside someone says more than words can. He stopped by the old oak at the end of the path, the one where he used to carve his initials as a child. He brushed his hand across the bark and whispered, almost to himself, "It feels strange coming back. Like everything stayed the same except me." "Growth always feels strange," I said. "It means you're paying attention." He smiled faintly, and for the first time since he'd arrived, his eyes seemed a little lighter. We stood there for a while, just listening to the world breathing around us. There was something healing about the stillness, the way the wind carried the scent of grass and the distant hum of life going on. When we turned back toward the house, Daniel looked at me and said quietly, "Thank you for not asking too many questions." I chuckled. "If I had, you probably wouldn't have answered them anyway." He laughed softly, and it was the first real laugh I'd heard from him all morning. It felt like a small victory, a crack in the heaviness he brought with him. As we reached the porch, I felt something shift between us. Not just the bond of family, but the kind of connection that happens when two people truly see each other as imperfect, trying, still learning. I didn't know then how much that moment would matter later. How his visit wasn't just about the mistake he'd made, but something deeper, something neither of us yet understood. All I knew was that he had come to me in the quiet of dawn, and somehow, without meaning to, we had both begun to heal. That afternoon, the house felt warmer, not because of the sun, but because of Daniel's presence. He had opened up a little, though I could still sense something unspoken resting behind his calm eyes. I busied myself with small things, folding laundry, tending to the plants by the window, giving him space but staying close enough that he'd know I was there if he needed me. He eventually joined me in the living room, holding an old photo album I hadn't seen in years. "I found this in your cabinet," he said, sitting beside me. "You used to keep all of these." I smiled, brushing off the thin layer of dust on the cover. "Your mother and I started that album the year you were born. I kept adding to it after she passed." He turned a few pages in silence, stopping at one where he was maybe 8 years old, missing a tooth and holding a fishing rod twice his size. "I remember this day," he murmured. "Uncle James caught that huge trout, and I cried because I thought it was too big to eat." "You were always the sensitive one," I said, laughing softly. "You used to talk to the fish before we let them go." His laugh joined mine, and for a moment, everything felt light again. But then, as he flipped another page, his hand slowed. His expression changed. The photo he'd stopped on was one of him and his father, my brother, standing beside that same oak tree we'd visited that morning. His father's hand was resting proudly on his shoulder. "I don't remember that day," Daniel said, voice quiet now. "I wish I did." The ache in his tone made my chest tighten. "You were only 6, I said gently. "But he was so proud of you that day. You tried to climb the tree, fell halfway, and he caught you before you hit the ground. You were furious he wouldn't let you try again." Daniel looked at the picture for a long time before speaking. "He was always trying to protect me," he whispered, "and I pushed him away a lot when I got older. I wanted to tell him that's what growing boys do, that he had nothing to feel guilty about, but I stopped myself. Sometimes what people need isn't reassurance. It's the space to feel what they're feeling." He set the album down carefully. "You know, I think that's what I've been doing again, pushing people away when they're just trying to help." He paused, rubbing his palms together. "The person I hurt, she reminded me a lot of him. Kind, patient, but I couldn't stand how she saw the good in me when I didn't feel it myself." I looked at him quietly, letting his words settle. "It's hard to accept kindness when you don't think you deserve it," I said, "but that's exactly when you need it the most." He nodded slowly, lost in thought. The light outside began to fade, soft oranges and purples painting the horizon. I could see the reflection of it in his eyes, like a mixture of peace and sorrow, healing and remembering. "You always make things sound simple," he said after a while. "It's not simple," I replied, shaking my head. "It's just honest. We all break a little inside, Daniel, but it's what we do with those cracks that matters. Some people hide them, others let the light through." He smiled faintly. "You sound like one of those old books you used to make me read." "Maybe those books knew something we didn't," I said with a grin. He leaned back against the couch and looked around the room. "It's funny," he said quietly. "This house hasn't changed much, but I feel like I'm seeing it differently now." "Sometimes," I said, "we only notice how comforting a place is when we've been away long enough to miss it." He nodded again, then turned to me. "Can I stay the night?" "Of course," I said without hesitation. "The guest room's always ready. It's been waiting for you." That night, after he went to bed, I sat alone in the dim light of the kitchen, a cup of tea warming my hands. I thought about how unexpected life can be, the people who show up at your door, the moments that bring old wounds back to the surface, the second chances we don't even realize we're being given. Daniel's visit had started as an apology, a confession, but now I was beginning to see it as something more. He wasn't just here to unburden himself. He was searching for connection, for a sense of belonging he didn't know he'd lost. And in some quiet way, he had given me that too. As I turned off the lights and headed to bed, I passed by his room. The door was half open, and the faint sound of steady breathing told me he was finally sleeping peacefully. For the first time in a long while, I felt at peace too. But deep down, I knew his story wasn't finished yet. Tomorrow would bring something new, something neither of us was prepared for. The next morning arrived with soft rain tapping against the windows. It wasn't the sharp kind that comes with thunder or wind. It was gentle, steady, like a whispering reminder that life moves in cycles of calm and renewal. I woke early, as I usually do, and stood by the window for a while, watching the world blur behind the drizzle. The garden looked alive again, the leaves glistening as if washed clean. I thought of Daniel still asleep in the next room, and for the first time in years, the house didn't feel empty. His presence had brought something with it, a quiet sense of meaning, of family rediscovered. I began making breakfast, letting the familiar rhythm of clinking dishes and humming kettle fill the silence. The smell of fresh coffee and toasted bread soon wandered through the hallways, and not long after, I heard his footsteps. "Morning," he said softly, his voice still rough with sleep. "Good morning," I replied, handing him a cup. "Looks like the rain's decided to stay for a while." He smiled faintly, sitting down. "Good. Maybe it'll give me an excuse to slow down for once." We ate quietly for a few minutes, just listening to the rain, but I could tell something was stirring in him. His expression had that thoughtful stillness again, the kind that comes before a truth is spoken. "Finally," he said, "I called her last night." I set my fork down gently. "And?" "She didn't answer," he said, "but I left a message. Told her I was sorry, not just for what I said, but for not listening when she needed me to." I nodded, feeling a warmth rise in my chest. "That took courage, Daniel. Sometimes saying sorry into the silence is harder than saying it to a face." He looked out the window, eyes tracing the trails of water running down the glass. "I don't know if she'll forgive me, but for the first time in a long while, I feel like I did the right thing." There was something peaceful in the way he said it, acceptance without expectation. Growth had taken root quietly inside him, and I realized that his visit wasn't just about seeking forgiveness from someone else. It was about finding it within himself. After breakfast, we sat in the living room again. The photo album from yesterday still rested on the coffee table. He picked it up, but instead of opening it, he just held it for a while. "I think I'm going to go see Dad's grave before I leave," he said. "It's been too long." I felt a lump in my throat but smiled through it. He'd like that. You don't have to say much. Just being there is enough. The rain slowed to a mist as we drove to the cemetery. The road was lined with soaped trees, their branches heavy and quiet. When we arrived, Daniel stood for a long time at his father's stone, hands deep in his coat pockets. I didn't intrude. I just watched, the same way I used to watch him take his first steps, always ready to catch him if he stumbled. Eventually, he knelt and brushed a few wet leaves aside. "I hope you're proud of me," he said softly. "I'm trying." Those two words, "I'm trying," carried more strength than any promise could. When we returned home, the sky had begun to clear, and faint sunlight peeked through the clouds. Daniel helped me bring in some laundry I'd forgotten on the line, and as we stood side by side folding it, I felt the kind of peace that doesn't come often but stays when it does. Before he left later that afternoon, he hugged me tightly. It wasn't a quick, polite hug. It was the kind that says everything words can't. "Thank you for that morning," he said quietly. "For listening, for not making me feel small." I smiled, patting his arm. "You've always been more than you realize, Daniel. Don't forget that. And remember, mistakes don't define us. What we choose after them does." He nodded, eyes glistening again. "I'll come by more often," he promised. "Don't wait until dawn next time," I teased, and we both laughed. I stood at the door and watched his car pull away, the tires sending up small splashes from the damp road. When the sound faded into the distance, I went back inside, the house quiet once more, but not lonely. because that visit, unexpected and early, had changed something. It reminded me that life still has its surprises, that love between family doesn't fade. It just waits quietly, like the dawn before the knock on the door. And sometimes all it takes is one early morning, one honest conversation, to remind us that even after all the storms and silences, connection can find its way home again.